This lecture material will highlight the respiratory system, and the corresponding lab material will also go through the main structures and functions of the respiratory system. And so when we look at this here, we see kind of the major structures: the nasal cavity, the nostrils, the oral cavity if air is coming in and out of the mouth, through the pharynx, and then the different airways of the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, and then those are going to move on into the lungs. Primarily, the respiratory system is involved in oxygenating, and I'll fix that, our blood. And so that's going to be important so that our heart can deliver that oxygenated blood to the rest of the body for us. Basically, the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system go hand in hand. One can't really work without the other. So if we look at kind of the functions of one of the functions of the respiratory system, which is referred to as respiration. Respiration actually falls into sort of 4 different categories. And the first is ventilation, which is simply just the movement of air in and out of the lungs, more or less a fancy word for breathing. Then we have what's called external respiration, and this is where the gases, primarily oxygen and carbon dioxide, are exchanged between the air in the lungs and the blood. Okay, so external respiration is going to be between the air in the lungs and then also the blood. So the external part of that, you can kind of think the air coming in from the outside. Another function of respiration is actually transporting that oxygen and carbon dioxide in the bloodstream. And this is basically, again, the major function of the respiratory system, to transport that oxygen, but this is actually a function that kind of fits more closely into our cardiovascular system. And then finally, internal respiration is the exchange of gases, again, oxygen and carbon dioxide, between the blood and our tissue cells. And then that way, our cells can use that oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. This is also a little bit more of a function of the cardiovascular system. And so basically what we see here is that one can't exist without the other. So if we look at kind of the transport and the internal respiration, this has a bit more to do with the cardiovascular system because it's the blood, but the blood can't be oxygenated without the respiratory system. So that's kind of how they both go hand in hand. In addition to respiration, the respiratory system has a number of other functions, one being gas exchange. Again, this is kind of what we just looked at with that respiration on the first slide. And what we're talking about here is that the blood becomes oxygenated and carbon dioxide is going to leave. The respiratory system also has a function in regulating our blood pH. Again, that blood pH. It's really important that our blood pH remain, again, between the levels of about 7.35 and 7.45. The way that our respiratory system can regulate blood pH is simply by changing the amount of carbon dioxide levels in the blood, and one of the ways that we can do this is through hyperventilation, so the old breathing into the paper bag trick, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. The respiratory system also functions to produce voice. Right now, as I'm speaking, I can feel air movement coming out with every word I make. And so basically, when the air is moving past your vocal folds, your vocal cords, that's what produces sound and also speech. Interestingly, olfaction or smell also occurs as part of the system. The respiratory system functions when different aroma molecules in the air are drawn into our nasal cavity. They're going to pass up through the ethmoid bone as well and stimulate those olfactory nerves. And finally, there's some protection within the respiratory system, basically referring to the fact that microorganisms are in the air, and so it's important to prevent them from getting deeper into the respiratory system. So there are protections in place to allow that to happen. to allow the prevention, I should say, of microorganisms getting deeper into our respiratory system. And we'll talk about some of those a little bit later too. In general, we can kind of divide the respiratory system into the upper and lower respiratory tract. Basically, anything above the larynx is considered the upper respiratory tract, so kind of more dealing with our head and upper neck, whereas the lower respiratory tract has to deal more with the structures that are in our neck and our chest. So the larynx, the trachea, and then our other airways, the bronchi and the lungs. Well, even though we distinguish between these two types of divisions, they're actually continuous. And so the cells that line these different types of structures are actually continuous upper and lower. That being said, if you've ever had an upper respiratory tract infection, say maybe some sort of cold or maybe an ear infection, that can actually morph into a lower respiratory tract infection and vice versa, because those cells are so continuous with one another. Mucus can get produced and that can settle down into the lower respiratory tract. If you think about kind of that oh so fun post-nasal drip, that can also kind of infect those lower areas as well. What we're going to do is kind of take a walk through the respiratory system if we were to follow a molecule of air. So first it's going to enter through the nose, and we have the external nose and also the external nares, which are the nostrils. Whoops, and that's where air will enter. And then inside of there is the nasal cavity. And the nasal cavity has a number of functions in addition to just smell, which I'm sure you're used to. It's a passageway for air, and it's going to also clean and humidify and warm the air as it comes in. I actually heard an I heard an interview a couple years ago about how, in general, some of the more northern Scandinavian countries have a lot of individuals with larger noses, and one of the interesting theories behind that is because the air is so cold and the nose serves to warm the air, having a larger nasal cavity may help to warm that. So kind of an interesting tidbit. But in addition to warming and humidifying and cleansing the air, we also have what are called paranasal sinuses, and sinuses are basically just holes in our bones that help to resonate speech and also help to lighten the skull a little bit. But if you think about if you've had a sinus infection or a nasal infection, it kind of changes your voice a little bit, right? You kind of have that cold voice. From the nose, there is the pharynx, and the pharynx again kind of gets divided into the nasopharynx, into the laryngopharynx, and the oropharynx in between those. And so when we look at the original picture here, I know it's not all labeled, but the nasopharynx is going to be right behind the nasal cavity, the oropharynx kind of what you know as your throat, and the laryngopharynx kind of opening into the larynx. All of that is considered the pharynx, but they have different divisions. Regardless, the pharynx is a common passageway for both the respiratory and digestive system. The nasopharynx really doesn't have anything to do with the digestive system unless your uvula stops working and you get food or water back up into your nasal cavity. Not so fun. The pharynx is lined with stratified squamous epithelium. If you recall, this is going to be many layers of flat cells. And if you think about that, if you're swallowing something, that's providing a lot of friction on those cells, and so if you only had one layer of cells there, you would lose your throat. And so having multiple layers of cells there is quite beneficial. If we keep moving, the next structure that air would move into is the larynx. And this picture is slightly different than what you have in your notes packet, but we can see the same type of information. Basically, the larynx is just an open passageway for air, and that's it. So when we look at the picture again, the larynx is right here, and behind it, which is not pictured here, is the esophagus, which is the passageway for food and liquids. And so it's important that this epiglottis, which covers the opening of the larynx, closes when you're swallowing food and liquids, because only air should be going through the larynx. And that's kind of listed here. We also have vocal folds, which are in this region, or your vocal cords, and this is the primary area for the production of sound. Also, when I'm speaking, if I put my hand where my larynx is, or otherwise known as the voice box, I can feel vibrations. And so what we see there, or what we're feeling, is that as air is moving past the vocal folds, it's vibrating them, and those different vibrations produce sound. And so different types of maneuvers can help you make higher pitched sounds or lower pitched sounds. I believe in your lab packet there's a YouTube web link there to see Steven Tyler's vocal cords from Aerosmith. Pretty impressive. So the larynx is basically this kind of shielded area up at the top here. And then just below the larynx, where it kind of looks like a vacuum hose, is the trachea. And the trachea is our windpipe. It's not very long, maybe about 4 inches. And what it does is, again, maintain an openness so that air can pass through there. And it's lined with hyaline cartilage. If you remember, that hyaline cartilage kind of looks like eyeball soup in a micrograph. And what this does, there's C-shaped rings, so again, that helps to maintain the openness. But what also happens is that when you are swallowing, for example, the esophagus is right behind the trachea, and so as food moves through the esophagus, it might expand that esophagus a little bit, but the trachea is protected, and it's not going to ever be completely closed off because it has these rigid rings. The trachea at the very base of it has what's called the carina, which is located here. And this is going to initiate your cough reflex. Basically, if anything other than air touches this carina, which is just like a little spur of tissue at the end of the trachea, that initiates the cough reflex, and then therefore you won't be introducing large particulate matter into your lower respiratory tract. So the trachea, very important. It's also lined on the inside with cilia, and so here is a picture of some cilia. I'm just going to make a note here for you. Lined with cilia. And cilia, again, help to move things past the cell. And so there's cilia, and there's also mucus. And what happens is that when you are breathing, you're taking in air, but you're also taking in particulate matter. And we don't want that to settle too low into our respiratory system. And so what we do is, or what the cilia does, is basically help to beat that mucus that can trap all that stuff in it, and it acts like an upstairs escalator. And so what that does is start to move that particulate matter, that mucus, up toward the top of your throat, and when you get the urge to clear your throat, that and then you swallow it, what that's doing is preventing that particulate matter from getting deeper into your respiratory tract. Smoking will paralyze cilia. So if you're a smoker, or you know a smoker who's prone to respiratory tract infections, that's because the cilia is not helping to prevent that particulate matter from settling into the respiratory system. Once we move out of the trachea, then we're going to move into this sort of network of cartilaginous pathways, air passageways that move into our lungs. So I'm going to kind of show you this slide as well as the one next to it to kind of deal with that, and we'll also go through these structures in the lab material. This is called the tracheobronchial tree, because if we look at this picture, we've got the trachea that we just talked about, and then the trachea is going to divide into what are called the bronchi, or bronchus for singular. And so the tracheobronchial tree, we're going to have what are called conducting zone structures. And conducting zone structures is basically from the trachea all the way through what are called our terminal bronchioles. So basically our trachea through the primary and secondary, tertiary bronchi, which we'll talk about, into the bronchioles. And all of these conducting zone structures have cilia, so they can remove debris, and it's basically just a passageway for air movement. So literally just the conduction of air. Also, it's going to maintain that the tube remain open, and that's important for air passageway as well. And there's smooth muscle that will be around, kind of exist around those cartilaginous tubes as you get a bit deeper into the tree. And what that does is help to dilate or constrict bronchioles. So one of the functions, for example, of epinephrine is to dilate bronchioles, and what that's going to do is open up that airway in the event of an allergic reaction, for example. Once we move past those terminal bronchioles, we're going to move into what are called respiratory bronchioles and then alveoli. And alveoli are basically air sacs, and I'm going to show you this here. So here at the end of the bronchioles, we have these alveoli or air sacs, and alveolus is just a singular. And these are called the respiratory zone, and the respiratory zone is just a site for the gas exchange, okay? So the conducting zone is just conducting air. The respiratory zone is actually exchanging gases. Again, this is going to be referring to oxygen and carbon dioxide. Here's another picture of that tracheobronchial tree, then we'll go through that in lab as well. The main job of our alveoli and our bronchioles is to, again, exchange gases. And this is going to occur at what is called the respiratory membrane. But before we get into that, I want to show you that when we look at our bronchioles and these alveoli, which are in these sacs, they kind of look like clusters of grapes, but they also kind of look like soccer balls, if you think about it that way. And if you think about being on the soccer field at the end of practice, throwing all the soccer balls into a big mesh bag, picture that mesh bag as these capillaries that surround the alveoli. So basically what we have is a direct correlation between the air and the blood. Now if we go back up to one of those first slides, our external respiration has to do with the movement of air in the lungs and the blood, and that's exactly what we're talking about here, okay? Now also, if you remember from the cardiovascular system, we have oxygen-poor blood coming from the heart, from our pulmonary arteries to the lungs, and we always say that just goes to the lungs to pick up oxygen. This is where that oxygen gets picked up, okay? So it gets loaded into the blood at these pulmonary capillaries, and then that oxygen-rich blood can go back to the heart through the pulmonary veins and get pumped throughout the body, which, if we go back to one of those first slides, would be the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So we can see again how the respiratory and cardiovascular systems are linked together. So this actual exchange of air then, like I said, takes place at what's called the respiratory membrane. And the respiratory membrane, there's also a worksheet in your notes packet that you'll be filling out that kind of goes through the respiratory membrane. But what I'm going to do is kind of illustrate that for you here. And this is where the actual gas exchange takes place. Now what we actually are looking at in the respiratory membrane are a couple of different things. We have basically the wall of the alveolus, cannot spell, which happens to be simple squamous epithelium. Okay. What we're also looking at is the wall of our pulmonary capillary, which also is simple squamous epithelium. Really good at diffusion, only one layer of cells, right, if it is simple squamous, which is great for what we need it for. If we look back at the alveolus on the left side here that I'm circling, again, picture an alveolus like a soccer ball. And each one of the little hexagons on a soccer ball represents one simple squamous cell. So if you kind of picture that in your mind, that's kind of what we're looking at here. here we're looking at kind of a cutaway of those soccer balls, if you will. In addition to simple squamous cells, we also have what are called cells that produce what's called surfactant. And what surfactant is going to do is to decrease or basically prevent the alveoli from collapsing. There's also a thin layer of water that's produced. And then finally, we see what are called macrophages, which are down here. These act as kind of a defense mechanism. These will destroy any bacteria that might be in the area, and they basically are constantly cleansing that region. Well, if we look then at the junction between the alveolus and here a capillary, that's where we have the respiratory membrane, and that's what we're looking at on this side. And this is pretty similar to your worksheet that you'll be looking at. Well, what we're looking at the respiratory membrane is the movement of oxygen, which is shown in red, and also the movement of carbon dioxide, which is shown in blue. And so what we can see here is that if you take a big deep breath in, you are breathing in oxygen. So you're going to have more oxygen in your alveolus than you do in your blood. Now, whenever we have more of something on a high concentration on one side of a membrane and a low concentration on the other side of the membrane, this should signal to you, oh, I know what that is. That is diffusion, right? And so with diffusion, we're going to see oxygen diffusing from the lungs into the blood. So this is the arrow here that shows that. And right here, diffusion of oxygen. Alternatively, at the same time, this blood that has returned to the lungs also has more carbon dioxide in it than the lungs do. So carbon dioxide is going to diffuse from the blood back into the lungs, and then we breathe it out. This right here at the respiratory membrane is also referred to as the external respiration that we looked at on one of the first slides. Okay, so that is also important. Again, what we're looking at is that at the respiratory membrane, when you breathe in oxygen, there's more oxygen in the lungs than in the blood. So oxygen diffuses from the lungs into the blood. And then there's more carbon dioxide in the blood than in the lungs. And so carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood into the lungs, and then we breathe it out. If you prefer a picture, you can look at that here. If you prefer that in text, we can look at this page here. So basically, we're looking at diffusion, gradients. Anytime you have a gradient, we're dealing with a difference on one side of a membrane than the other. So oxygen is going to move from the alveoli, which is in the lungs, into the blood. And then basically, oxygen will move through the bloodstream. The pressure is decreasing, and then oxygen will move from the tissue cells. This should say from the tissue. This says tissue capillary. So basically moving from the blood into our cells. This sentence here represents what's called internal respiration, and this part up here is the external respiration. So basically, oxygen moves from the lungs to the blood, and then from the blood to the tissues. Okay, so if we kind of put that here, lungs to blood, and then blood to our tissues. Alternatively, with our carbon dioxide moves from our tissues into our tissue capillaries, and that's also part of that internal respiration. And then it moves from our blood in the lungs to the alveoli. And this is external respiration. So it's the opposite here, where we're going to see carbon dioxide moving from the tissues to the blood to the lungs. So whenever we talk about gas exchange in the lungs, we're always talking about carbon dioxide and oxygen, but they're always moving in opposite directions from one another. So I'll give you some time to, you can kind of listen to that again or walk through it again if you need to, but there is a worksheet at the end of in your lecture packet dealing with with the respiratory membrane. Now, if we talk about the lungs, so basically we've moved from our upper respiratory tract into our lower respiratory tract, and then the lungs are basically 3 lobes on the right side, 2 lobes on the left side, and the alveoli that are within the lungs, there's about 300 million of them. What we also have in the lungs, if you remember, they are surrounded by a visceral and parietal pleura, and those are types of serous membranes, and there's a fluid between them that helps to maintain pressure and decrease friction. The lungs, and I'll actually show you that, not on this slide, we'll go back to this slide, but this one here, the pleura, again, which are part of a serous membrane. Remember that the visceral pleura is what is attached to the lung, and the parietal pleura is attached to the outside wall. And so when we look at pleura, there's a fluid inside, like I said, that helps to decrease friction when the lungs are expanding. And it's actually a negative pressure that helps to keep the lungs inflated, which is quite important. Now, if we go back to this page, this is dealing with actually breathing and the muscles of respiration, which again is breathing. So we're going to look at inspiration versus expiration. And inspiration is basically inhaling. And what happens when you inhale is that the ribs elevate, your diaphragm moves down and your diaphragm contracts, and then your external intercostal muscles also contract. So your muscles contract. And what also happens is that the volume increases within your lungs, right? So if you take a big deep breath right now, you can probably tell your chest is rising, you can feel that, you can see that, and your volume is increasing. But what also happens when volume increases is that the pressure inside the lungs is actually going to decrease. So volume and pressure are inversely related. They are opposite of one another. The reason for this is that if you think about gases, like oxygen, carbon dioxide, gases will always fill the space that they're in. Okay, so even right now, the room you're sitting in, there's lots of air molecules that are bouncing off the walls, bouncing off your face. You can't feel it, but they're there. If you all of a sudden were to throw a wall up in the middle of that room, and now you have less space, less volume, but the same amount of gas particles, well, now they have less space, and so they're going to collide with each other more often, and this is going to increase the pressure. So alternatively, with inspiration or inhaling, is the volume increases, that's more space for the air to move, and so there's going to be less frequent collisions of those air molecules. And so the pressure ends up decreasing. Well, the pressure ends up decreasing in the lungs, and it becomes lower than the outside. So now we have a greater pressure outside than we do inside. So greater, we should say the outside pressure is greater than the inside. And so pressure always moves from high to low, so that way air moves into the lungs. Okay, we know that from inhaling, but the reason why is because volume and pressure are inversely related. On the other hand, with expiration, we're going to see just the opposite. Okay, so with expiration, this is basically your exhaling. Oh, I'm sorry about that. So this is your exhaling. The respiratory muscles, your diaphragm, your external intercostal muscles, are going to relax rather than contract. And then what we're also going to see when you exhale, the volume in your lungs is going to decrease. So now if you think about the volume decreasing in your lungs, what's that going to do to pressure? if the volume decreases, this is the example of I throw a wall in the middle of the room and now those air molecules are going to be bombarding each other more. Well, the pressure is actually going to increase. And now the pressure increases such that the pressure inside the lungs is greater than the pressure outside the lungs. And so, since pressure moves from high to low, air is going to move out of the lungs. So that's kind of the basis for breathing and ventilation. And the key here is that the pressure is what moves the air into the lungs and what moves the air out of the lungs. The pressures we're talking about are the pressure within the lungs and then the atmospheric pressure, the pressure around you. And that's different. And that's why we can see that that's going to happen. And so when we talk about ventilation, I'm going to skip that because we already talked about it. Again, ventilation is just the movement of air into and out of the lungs, which is what we know as breathing. And air will move from high pressure to low pressure. Liquids move from high to low pressure as well. So this means that in this case, for our gases, the pressure is inversely related to volume, or we could say the opposite. And so again, if pressure is up, volume is down, and if pressure is down, volume is up. However you want to look at that. So they're inversely related, and that is what drives air movement into and out of our lungs. Another way that we can measure ventilation is through what's called spirometry, or using a spirometer. I'm not going to go too much into detail on this. Those of you that move on to general and ultimately advanced A&P will get to actually work with a spirometer. But what it does is actually just measure the different types of volume in your lungs. So normal breathing is called tidal volume, and basically the amount, if you take a big inhale or a big exhale, we have different types of reserve volumes that we can measure as well. All of our breathable or all of our exchangeable air is what's called our vital capacity, and then anything in the lungs is called our total lung capacity. Again, without going into too much detail, we can use these numbers to understand lung function of different individuals. The last chunk of this material is dealing with how respiration is regulated in the brain. So if you remember from the nervous system, we talked about how the medulla oblongata and the pons both have important roles in breathing. And the pons is more with kind of switching between inhaling and exhaling, switching between resting and waking, etc. Sleeping or exercising as well. Whereas the medulla is really what stimulates the respiratory muscles to contract. Remember, we just talked about how with inspiration, anytime you inhale, the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles, which are between the ribs, have to contract. So in order for that to happen, we can look at this chart here. And the medulla, again, oblongata, and then here's the pons. These have the respiratory centers, and these will stimulate the movement of those muscles. Remember that the diaphragm is stimulated by the phrenic nerve, and the intercostal muscles are stimulated by the intercostal nerves. So what will actually trigger this to happen? Well, if we look here at the brain, remember our cerebrospinal fluid, if there's an increase in carbon dioxide in our blood, what that is going to do is actually drive down the pH. So more carbon dioxide in the blood, just add a little note here. So more CO2 in the blood makes it more acidic, which lowers the pH of the blood. And that is bad, right? The pH has to remain in a certain area. So this is all going to be sensed by the medulla oblongata in that cerebrospinal fluid. And then what can happen is if the carbon dioxide level is too high, then we start to see increased basically action potentials to our respiratory muscles, and that causes hyperventilation. What hyperventilation does is literally blow off excess carbon dioxide. And so by releasing more carbon dioxide, you will end up reversing this pathway and bringing the body back to homeostasis. Interestingly, if there's a low amount of oxygen, that can also play a role in breathing, but carbon dioxide has a much larger role in regulating ventilation than oxygen does. And that's what we see on the next slide. And I have a little star here for you because this is an important concept. With chemical control, carbon dioxide is the major regulator of our blood pH and breathing. So again, if there's an increase or decrease in our pH of the blood, that can trigger respiration by stimulating the medulla to stimulate those breathing muscles. Oxygen can also affect breathing, but only if there's a very significant decrease in oxygen. The cerebrum and the limbic system, your emotional brain, can actually also regulate your respiration. If you think about emotion, for example, that might have an impact in your breathing. Finally, if we look at the effects of aging, and different types of environmental exposures. Again, I know your slides are just slightly different here, but the amount of oxygen and space that we have is going to decrease. The amount of our breathing rate might decrease as well. We may see more residual volume and sort of what's called dead space in the lungs. The ability to clear that mucus from our respiratory system might also decrease, which can, in effect, lead to more susceptibility of infection. The exchange of gases becomes reduced. This might lead to more labored breathing and things like that. In terms of environmental exposures, on the left-hand side here, things like tobacco smoke, exposure to different types of air pollution and different pollutants can speed up the rate of things like emphysema and chronic bronchitis, both of which can lead to respiratory failure if not taken care of. And lastly, lung cancer. Now, smoking does increase your risk for lung cancer. Smoking doesn't always cause lung cancer, and non-smokers can get lung cancer as well. Still don't condone smoking, but regardless, what lung cancer is going to do is remain a little bit silent, but what it can do besides decrease lung function is metastasize, or basically spread through the body as well, which can be quite detrimental. And so some things to think about there. Basically, it eats away at that lung tissue, which is going to eat away at your air sacs, your alveoli.